Hey gang, it's your boy. Welcome to the final installment of my retro gaming history, the 16-bit era. Now it's been a minute to get to this point, and because of that, this video will be the last in the series. Sit back, relax, and strap in, gang, as this episode is a beefy one. Like previous episodes, feel free to use the timestamps in the description below to navigate. Check out the links while you're there to follow me on social media and find out how you can support this channel and get more content. In this video, we'll be looking at the hardware battling it out during the peak of the console wars. Let's check out our competitors. NEC's TurboGrafx-16, the Sega Genesis, and the Super Nintendo Entertainment System. Like any decent schoolyard fanboy pissing contest, let's start with the numbers. I grabbed these specs from a Reddit post that quickly fell into familiar territory, where commenters started picking apart the stats posted and speculating on the validity of the numbers, with most citing their own favorite as the best console. Back in the day, it always went down the same way. You could quote specs till you were blue in the face, or regurgitate marketing gibberish like blast processing to prove your side was right, but it really came down to the titles of the games you wanted to play. If you liked Sonic the Hedgehog, Sega sports titles, and wanted the uncensored Mortal Kombat, you went with the Genesis.
Mortal Kombat on Sega Genesis is the best video game ever.
I disagree. It's a very good game, but I think Donkey Kong is the best game ever.
If you wanted to play Donkey Kong Country and Super Mario World, you got a Super Nintendo.
Donkey Kong sucks.
You know something? You suck.
Or, if you like shooters and Bonk, then you got the TurboGrafx-16. But because our experiences inform our judgment, let's take a look at the games I played for each one of these 16-bit juggernauts. We'll start with the TurboGrafx-16. NEC's TurboGrafx-16 was the first console on the 16-bit scene, launched in Japan on October 30th, 1987 as the PC Engine. The North American release of the TurboGrafx-16 occurred on August 29th, 1989, and soon had a notable mascot, a wall-chomping, vine-swinging, totally tubular baby named Bonk.
You're a cave dude.
Oh, sorry, Cave Dude. This was also the only 16-bit console I almost bought. You see, my friend wanted to sell it to me and was going on vacation, so he let me try it out before buying it. I soon found out why he was selling it, as the AC adapter port on the system had been damaged in some way, and I could only get it to make contact reliably by looping a long rubber band around the adapter plug and the body of the console. Now, I wasn't going to buy it because of the power problems, but I sure had fun with the games it came with for the 2 weeks I had it that summer. I beat Bonk's adventure a couple times. It was a great platformer with an interesting feel, smooth controls, and oversized, hilarious-looking bosses. Bonk's invincibility powers came from overly spicy meats held by off-colored baddies. Before and after the invincibility, you got increased attack power, which also let you bonk the ground and freeze the screen temporarily. And after defeating each boss, you're presented with a totally 90s message as a reward. This game was very well put together, with a fun look and solid replay value. Keith Courage in Alpha Zones was another platformer that got a lot of my attention during that time. It was also the launch title for the TurboGrafx-16 briefly before Bonk came on the scene. The case included a comic book to make up for the lack of in-game story. I laughed at it initially because of its cutesy weeb overworld levels and their shamelessly easy enemy characters. But this game really shined in the levels between, where Keith Courage donned the Nova suit. That mechanized power suit was capable of shooting bolt bomb projectiles and had upgradable swords. The underworld levels were more hectic and dangerous, with a variety of fast-moving, imaginative-looking enemy characters and level bosses. The overworld level served as a break in the action, which kind of messed you up for the pacing of the more difficult underworld. In the overworld, you could buy healing from Nurse Nancy, bolt bombs from the Wise Wizard, and upgrade your sword with the Weapons Master. Of course, all this cost money, which you got by farming coins from the pushovers walking around outside. Thankfully, it didn't take too long to farm them, because that was the only part of the game that felt like a chore. The controls on this game weren't the greatest, and most of your deaths would be from falling or getting bounced back into spikes. And I swear I'm not poo-pooing this game. I really enjoyed it. I think the game's breakneck mechanics made it more interesting to play, because you knew it was possible to land that jump, no matter how cheesy it felt the last time you failed. Bloody Wolf was the next game, other than Bravoman, that I played a lot of. It was a military action shooter that had a top-down view, where you chose one of two characters and could assign your own codename. You could shoot a full 360 degrees and lob grenades at the enemy combatants while finding keys and hostages that gave you specialized equipment or tips about the area. The keys would unlock crates inside buildings containing upgraded weapons, vehicles, and steroids?
You son of a bitch.
The vehicles you could use in combat, like this motorcycle with a mounted gun, would eventually run out of fuel and detonate, naturally. The bad guys could lob grenades, shoot at you, or launch attacks from futuristic ordnance, and there was plenty of barbed wire to get stuck in. Some of the enemy characters would even flash, under the influence of the muscle emphasis tablets, no doubt.
What's the matter? The CIA got you pushing too many pencils?
The bosses and mini-bosses were what you'd expect, but had decent programming and were challenging to defeat. Throw in some great music and cutscenes, and this game had me coming back for more. I'll briefly mention Moto Roader, because I did play it a little. It seemed promising at the outset with anime hotties and appealing pre-stage vehicle graphics, but once I found out it was a top-down racer, I quickly lost interest. I guess someone could have enjoyed it, if you're into that sort of thing.
Not that there's anything wrong with that.
Rounding out the TurboGrafx 16 experience, I'm going to end on Bravoman. Which was a translation of the PC Engine arcade port of the same name, and because of that, it was very Japanese. This game was both difficult and funny. Bravoman's story was one of a car salesman turned superhero in order to defeat the evil Dr. Bomb.
I'm Dr. Bomb.
Before he could take over the world. The game would switch between street-level platforming to undersea shooter, turning Bravoman into an aquatic vehicle. In the platforming levels, Bravoman would use his telescopic limbs and neck to attack the enemy characters, and would occasionally interact with allies after collecting enough fuku. The game's platforming mechanics were based on the length of button presses. If you held down jump, you'd get Bravoman's highest jump, and if you held down the attack button, you'd get his furthest distance attack, as opposed to a quicker button tap. Some of the most fun came from beating on your allies, who would eventually stop helping you if you overdid it, and start to actively mock you if you went too far. But the over-the-top Dr. Bomb appearing between each level directing his minions was more than enough to keep me playing. Now let's take a look at my personal favorite, the Sega Genesis. I loved playing the Genesis. I don't think I've ever found another console that seemed as sleek and sexy, yet gritty and powerful. If you were in the Sega fanboy camp like I was, rooting for your team was an easy and comfortable position to be in. You had Sega's beatdown of an ad campaign against their biggest initial competitor, the NES, and continued trash talk of the Super Nintendo during its early years. That media campaign alone was enough to make the Nintendo fanboys doubt their position on a very fundamental level, and was a stroke of genius. It's too bad Sega decided to move on to expansions instead of focusing on its 16-bit titles, or even moving on to the next console, the Saturn, which would have enabled a continued trouncing of Nintendo's 16-bit freshly baked offering. But that's the way that cookie crumbled. Unfortunately for me, and this may come as a surprise to some of you, I never owned a Sega Genesis.
How dare you!
I know.
You have stolen my dreams and my childhood with your empty words. How dare you!
But I never had to, because most of my friends had one, and a couple of them would lend the system to me for weekends while they were away. I did rent one from time to time at my local video store, but if I ever wanted to play Mortal Kombat, for instance, my friend Curtis was a 5-minute bike ride away. Let's talk about that game first. I still remember the first time I keyed in the blood code on Mortal Kombat.
Get over here!
Curtis was just happy to have an opponent, but was blown away by the blood code, which he hadn't heard of yet. For a 12-year-old boy back then, it was like looking at the swimsuit edition of Sports Illustrated for the first time, but with so much more blood. Being able to ignite your opponent in a fatality or rip out their spine instead of finishing them in some bloodless, bland way was incredible. The only game that came close to Mortal Kombat at the time for sheer brutality was Eternal Champions, another fighting game, but an exclusive to Sega, and the first game to be built from the ground up for the Genesis. Eternal Champions had overkills, which were basically stage fatalities triggered by the location on the screen where you landed your final blow. Getting back to Mortal Kombat, my favorite fighter has always been Scorpion, but I did have minor interests in Raiden, Sub-Zero, and Liu Kang. Although the Super Nintendo version was more faithful to the arcade in terms of sound and colors displayed, the color it really needed to display more of was blood red. How lame. I would get to play Sonic the Hedgehog 2 for the Genesis when friends of my family lent us their system when they were away on weekends. I completed Sonic 1 and 2 multiple times, and played a fair amount of Sonic and Knuckles and Sonic CD, but out of all of them, Sonic 2 was my favorite. I would have argued back then that the best 16-bit music of all time was in Sonic the Hedgehog 2, from Emerald Hill to Mystic Cave, and all the way through to its triumphant ending theme. I've used several of these tracks as background music in videos on my main channel because they still hold up to this day. Sonic 2 was the first game in the series to introduce the spin dash, fixing an annoying game mechanic from the other titles that slowed down the gameplay at times when trying to perform a spin attack. This game also introduced us to Sonic's sidekick, Miles Tails Prower, who was an AI-controlled fox, mimicking Sonic's moves as you sped through each of the game's 11 zones, and occasionally pointed out the way when he perceived Sonic was going the wrong direction. You could also race against a friend in the 2-player split-screen mode, with the winner having collected the most rings, items, and finishing the levels the quickest. Another new feature in this sequel was the special stages that could be accessed through any of the checkpoint posts after collecting 50 rings. Your AI pal Tails would join you here as well, collecting enough rings and avoiding bombs and half-pipe courses to eventually collect one of the 7 Chaos Emeralds. As with the first Sonic game, once the 7th Chaos Emerald was obtained, it unlocked Supersonic mode and changed the ending of the game. You could use an overly complicated cheat code to unlock Supersonic as well, but that still wouldn't give you the good ending that collecting all the Chaos Emeralds did. Lastly, a new enemy was introduced, Metal Sonic, who appeared just prior to the final boss fight with the humongous Dr. Robotnik mech. Despite later games introducing even more characters and game mechanics, this game was the high watermark of the 16-bit leg in the franchise for me. And to this day, I'll still load up Sonic the Hedgehog 2 if I feel the need to scratch that itch. Another game my friend Curtis and I played frequently was Road Rash. An Electronic Arts motorcycle racing game with a violent twist that also showcased just how well early Sega Genesis games could produce great 16-bit music. The gameplay was centered on winning races, by both outperforming and optionally beating the crap out of your opponents with punches, kicks, and clubs. This edgy racing game pitted you against 14 other AI racers that ranged from friendly allies to ruthless enemies. Though you could piss off the friendlier racers if you persisted in attacking them during a race, changing their in-race and intermission responses and behaviors. Winning races allowed you to upgrade your bike and advance to other stages of the game. The comic relief in Road Rash was mostly present in the intermission messages from motorcycle patrol officers like O'Rourke, who were immune to attacks but would arrest you if they were close to you when you got knocked off your bike, taking you out of the race and removing precious funds with their fines. It had a 2-player mode, but only in alternating turns between players. Split-screen simultaneous play would have to wait for Road Rash 2. Its breakneck speeds and cow-jumping fun still compel me to pick up a controller and enjoy a little Road Rash even now. Lastly, let's talk a little bit about the Streets of Rage series. Now, I never got a chance to play Streets of Rage back in the day, but subscribers to my main channel have most likely seen my net play of Streets of Rage 2. This beat-em-up series is both addictive and fun, with 2-player co-op action, and has even more amazing 16-bit music tracks that I also utilize in my videos, because they're still just that good. Axel is the main protagonist of the playable characters, but other great fighters rotate in throughout the 3 games in the series. Another reason for including this title is the upcoming release of Streets of Rage 4, which looks very promising and will definitely be my next Nintendo Switch purchase. Once it comes out, perhaps I'll review it, if I can scrape enough money together for a capture card, that is. Subscribe to my Subscribestar. Speaking of Nintendo, let's move on to the Super Nintendo Entertainment System. The most recent 16-bit console launched amongst our 3 competitors had a few advantages due to its late arrival on the scene, including better chip technology and ingenious architecture that allowed Nintendo to implement co-processors in its individual game cartridges that enhanced those games with advanced effects for sprite scaling, rotation, and real-time polygon drawing, like in Star Fox. These FX chips would solidify Nintendo's long game win in the 16-bit console wars. Unfortunately for its consumers, this meant cartridge prices for these enhanced games stayed at the higher end of the price range. The other advantage over the Sega Genesis was the updated sampling utilized in its 16-bit music, which created the ability to bring in a larger range of sound schemes like orchestral ambiance and realistic instrument emulation. This was not an advantage over the TurboGrafx-16, however, as it also had the superior sampling capability, though it was less relied upon in its music and used more sparingly to emulate voices in games like Bravoman.
I'm Dr. Bomb.
I had a frenemy in those early days named Brian, who was so convinced that the Super Nintendo had the best 16-bit sound that he made a mixtape of Super Castlevania IV and F-Zero music to try and prove his point. At the time, I had to admit that Vampire Killer on Super Castlevania sounded fantastic. But if I had known about the PC Engine CD release of Dracula X Rondo of Blood, I would have thrown that in his face and waited for the inevitable mountain of excuses and hand-waving. Seriously though, Brian and I were best friends, and he often invited me to his house to play his collection of Super Nintendo games, like Super Castlevania IV. This version of Castlevania had a ton going for it, not only with the sampled music score and effects, but also the sprite rotation capabilities of the Super Nintendo, and the introduction of multi-directional whip attacks and the whip flailing mechanism, not to mention the added depth of multiple background layers. My least favorite mechanic of this game would have to be the bat ring whip swinging, which mostly felt gimmicky to me, but definitely added to the game's difficulty level. I still play Super Castlevania IV occasionally, but if I really want a challenge, I'll often choose the Turbo CD Dracula X Rondo of Blood instead, because, in my opinion, it just looks, plays, and sounds better. In the early 90s, Maximum Carnage swept the Marvel Comics universe and made its way onto the 16-bit platforms of the Genesis and the Super Nintendo. In spite of my flag being clearly planted in the Sega camp, Spider-Man and Venom, Maximum Carnage, was the only game where I preferred the Super Nintendo release.
But no matter how sad and angry I am, I do not want to believe that.
Because of that, I would play this game occasionally at my friend Ron's house. I loved this title because I'm a fan of that crossover event in Marvel Comics. Though both 16-bit releases received middling reviews at the time from games journalists, I still enjoyed the beat-em-up action. The partially animated cutscenes were lifted right out of the books, and the soundtrack by Green Jello was just awesome. The whole cast of characters from the storyline were in the game to help you as you made your way through the levels chasing Carnage and his crew as Spider-Man or Venom. Strangely, those same super perceptive journalists often referred to these games as nearly identical. But if that were the case, I'd be playing this on the Genesis, right? I mean, even back then, games journalists were unreliable at best, and you often had to just try the game anyway. Can you guess what the difference was that had me playing a game I was truly excited about on the Super Nintendo instead of my preferred system? If you guessed sound sampling, you'd be correct. From the opening theme song to the repetitive punching and knockout sounds, it all just sounded better on the Super Nintendo. Another game I played was the hilarious stop-motion animated fighting game Clay Fighter. A lampoon of Street Fighter, using characters you'd find in a circus or bad B-movies. Lots of colorful slapstick humor and wacky sound effects were perfectly delivered by the Super Nintendo.
Ladies and gentlemen, here are the combatants for this extravaganza. Blue Suede Goo versus Cassie.
You could play it on the Genesis, but it felt like there was a lot missing. In no other fighter could you have an Elvis impersonator go up against a deranged snowman or a pumpkin-headed ghost face off with a Viking opera singer. With all that hilarity going on, no matter who lost the match, everyone involved won in some way.
Hey, what's the hair, man?
My favorite part of the game were the closing insults by characters like Bonkers
I told you I'd win.
and Blue Suede Goo.
Thank you very much.
I'll briefly talk about the Super Nintendo's launch title, Super Mario World. As a Mario fan, having played all the NES titles and Game Boy releases, I hated it. In my opinion, it was overly drawn out and boring. Yoshi was kinda cool, but not enough to make up for that cape.
Gay!
Moving on. Let's end on a high note for this console's games, with the one and only title I ever rented the Super Nintendo for, Street Fighter II: The World Warrior. This game was so popular and so impressive that it literally sold millions of Super Nintendo consoles in '92. It was a smart move on Nintendo's part to lock in that exclusivity with Capcom. The 6.3 million cartridges sold gave Nintendo one of its first big wins in the 16-bit arena. The Genesis had to wait over a year for Street Fighter II Champion Edition to arrive, selling only 1.65 million cartridges. Now you all should know how awesome this game is, and you don't need me to tell you about it, so I'll just say this. Ken is my boy, and Chun-Li will always be my best waifu. As you may well know, in order to try and take over each other and Nintendo, Sega and NEC released CD add-ons that negated the Super Nintendo's alleged superior sound and expanded game storage capacity way beyond that of any cartridge-reliant system. Sega further went on to release the 32X add-on, which buried the Super Nintendo's graphical advantage in colors displayed and gave us one of the first gaming memes. Other than the aforementioned Dracula X Rondo of Blood, I'm not going to talk about the add-on releases, or this video would never end. So now that we've seen and heard some of these games, which 16-bit console was the best? Well, if you're talking sales and longevity, it was the Super Nintendo. If you're looking at which console had more graphic content, then it was the Sega Genesis. If you want to talk about what console had the best sound, you could make arguments for each of them being the best. But like I said before, it's really all about what games you wanted to play, and they're all winners in that scenario. Ah, fuck that.
Genesis does.
What Nintendo?
And that brings us to the end of my retro gaming history. And thanks for watching this series, gang. And if you haven't seen the other episodes in this series, please go back and watch them in the playlist link in the description below. And don't forget to check out my links for social media and how to support me on Subscribestar. But again, thanks so much for watching. I've been your boy, Richard Rizzo, and you've all been great, I guess. I'll see you next time. Peace out.